Hello friends, this is Garlic, and once again, welcome back home to Rivervale. Now, I think it's finally time, you guys. It's finally time to talk about one of the most important and influential spells in the history of the game, Counterspell. So, Counterspell is one of the most classic fantasies of the mages, the foundation of a magical duel, you and your opponent throwing spells at each other while trying to negate what the other person is doing. However, this spell has been the topic of discussion for many years now because, honestly, it was quite overpowered in 5th edition. And then, when they tried to fix it in 2024, it became quite underwhelming. So on this video we're going to take a look at both versions, see what each version did right, and where each version lacked, and we're going to try to create a final version, one final counterspell to rule them all, and one that we would be happy to use in our games. So without further ado, let's jump right in. This is the old version of Counterspell, the 2014 version, and it's a 3rd level abjuration spell. It says that you can cast it as a reaction, which you take when you see a creature within 60 feet of you casting a spell, and it only has a somatic component. It says that you attempt to interrupt a creature in the process of casting a spell. If the creature is casting a spell of 3rd level or lower, its spell fails and has no effect. If it's casting a spell of 4th level or higher, make an ability check using your spellcasting ability. The DC equals 10 plus the spell's level. On a success, the creature's spell fails and has no effect. And at higher levels, when you cast a spell using a spell slot of 4th level or higher, the interrupted spell has no effect if its level is less than or equal to the level of the spell slot you used. So basically, if you cast it at its 3rd level, it automatically counters a spell of 3rd level or lower, and when you cast it at a higher level, it automatically counters a spell of the level that you cast it or lower, and if the spell that you're trying to counter is of a higher level than the slot you used, then you have to roll, and the DC becomes higher based on the level of the spell that you're trying to counter. Now, there were a lot of issues with this version of Counterspell, and let's look at a few problems that people had with it. So, it's an automatic success in a lot of cases, which generally goes against the philosophy of the game. Most spells and effects that affect somebody else in a negative way, they carry some sort of risk. Either you have to succeed on a roll, or the enemy has to fail on a saving throw. But Counterspell is one of those rare cases where it's quite easy to make it an automatic success, and a lot of people didn't like that. Also, the way that a lot of tables run the game, the player usually has enough information to ascertain what spell is being cast, which means that they know at which level they need to cast the spell to make it an automatic success. And this is an important issue because the way that the game was designed, when the DM says that an enemy casts a spell, the DM doesn't describe, is not intended to describe what spell is being cast. The player has to decide whether they want to counter that spell or not, and then after the spell succeeds, then we get to see what the spell did. However, because we usually try to make the game more thematic, we will often describe the spell as producing certain magical effects visually before the spell is actually completed. So we might describe some fire coming out if it's a fireball spell, we might describe some purple glow if it's an enchantment spell or a charm, and so based on that, usually the player has some information, especially an experienced player, to know what spell is being cast. And that is absolutely not what the designers intended. Now, I'm not going to get into a lot of detail on this particular point because there is actually a better video for you to watch. I'm going to post a link to it at the comments of this video, and it's made by a creator called Level 20 DM. He's a great creator in general. I think you're going to enjoy a lot of his videos, but if you want to learn more about that particular point, you can go check out his video in the comments of this one. I'm going to move on for now, because there is another issue with the old Counterspell, well, or any Counterspell really, which is that based on action economy, especially in a boss fight, it's usually multiple player characters fighting a single enemy. And so if that enemy spell gets countered, then the enemy has lost its entire turn, while the players have only used up a single reaction, one of their reactions. And what's more, at higher levels of play, Counterspell is a low-level spell at that point, yeah? And it's a low-level spell that can negate even a high-level spell. So putting all of those things together, Counterspell became a quite potent spell to the point where it could ruin certain scenes. Right? Certain scenes, certain boss fights, certain encounters could become a lot less thematic or climactic because somebody used Counterspell, which is not what we want. And this is the real issue with spells like this, is that if they don't carry enough risk, then we're basically ruining narrative moments for nothing. So Wizards of the Coast tried to fix this, and this is what they came up with. This is the new version of the spell. Still a 3rd level abjuration, and it still takes a reaction to cast, which you take when you see a creature within 60 feet of yourself, casting a spell with, that is new, verbal, somatic, or material components. That is a nice, good addition there. It still only requires somatic components on your part, just a gesture to break the spell. It says you attempt to interrupt a creature in the process of casting a spell. The creature makes a Constitution saving throw, and on a failed save, the spell dissipates with no effect, and the action, bonus action, or reaction used to cast it is wasted. If that spell was cast with a spell slot, the slot isn't expended. So now, it's no longer an automatic success, and we are no longer the ones to roll. The enemy gets to roll, the target gets to roll a Constitution saving throw. So based on that, I assume that the premise now is that you're trying to break the enemy's concentration as they're casting the spell. The Constitution saving throw is what we usually roll to maintain concentration, so I think that this is what they were going for here. And of course, when on a failed save, the spell dissipates and the action is wasted, sure, but on the new version, the slot is not expended. So this is quite different than the old version, and the power level is also quite a few ways apart. Now, I'm not personally a fan of the new version of Counterspell, but before we get into the criticism, let's look at what the new version did right. So the first thing is that Counterspell is no longer an automatic success, and therefore it is more balanced. That is something that I actually agree with. And the other thing is that subtle spells can no longer be countered, which is very thematic. You must be able to see somebody cast a spell, and the spell must have a component, a somatic, material, or verbal component. So, if somebody casts a spell using the subtle metamagic option, the subtle spell metamagic option, then potentially that spell is uncounterable, which is very, very nice. Now let's look at what the new version doesn't do as well. The first thing is that it makes Constitution saving throw proficiency even more important than it already was. Now, of course, we know that all saving throws can be potentially very useful, all saving throw proficiencies, but usually Dexterity, Constitution, and Wisdom proficiencies are more commonly used than everything else. And because Constitution saving throw is the one that is used for concentration, it already becomes very, very important. It's probably the most important saving throw in the game, especially for spellcasters. And now, by giving it yet another use, right, it becomes even more important. Now, a spellcaster that doesn't have Constitution saving throw proficiency is a spellcaster that can be countered very easily. And so we're putting people in a specific mentality where they feel that they need to have proficiency in Constitution saving throws or they suck as a mage, which is not good for the game. The other thing is that now the enemy spell slot is not being used up, which means that Counterspell is only good in very specific circumstances. If the enemy is not wasting their spell slot when you succeed on your counterspell, that means that you're only just buying time. You're buying an extra turn without that spell being cast, but that spell will be cast again. And then the next time you might not be able to stop it. So instead of being a duel where you try to waste the resources and they're trying to waste yours, now it's only about time. Which, it's not bad as an idea, but it makes this spell very, very circumstantial. Now the last thing is that now we don't get to roll against the card whose spell we're trying to break. They get to roll a Constitution saving throw, which feels a lot less thematic, right? It's fun when we get to roll, when the player gets to roll in order to stop something that the enemy is doing. It feels more involved and fun and personal, and I quite like the fact that the caster of Counterspell get to roll in order to break a spell, which is no longer the case. So, having looked at what the new version does better or worse than the previous one, we're gonna try to make one final version that keeps the best of both worlds. And this is it. So this is the fixed version of Counterspell. It's the level 3 abjuration. It takes a reaction to cast, which you take when you see a creature within 60 feet of yourself casting a spell with verbal, somatic, or material component. It says, you attempt to interrupt a creature in the process of casting a spell. Make a d20 test, adding your spellcasting ability modifier and your proficiency bonus against the creature's spell save DC. If you succeed, then the spell dissipates with no effect, and the action, bonus action, or reaction used to cast it is wasted. If you fail, the spell is cast normally. If the spell you're trying to counter is of a lower level than the level at which you cast Counterspell, then you have advantage on the roll. And if the spell you're trying to counter is of a higher level than the level at which you cast Counterspell, then you have disadvantage on the roll. So let's take a look at what this version accomplishes, right? Now, like in the 2024 version, subtle spells are uncounterable. the target must be casting a spell with verbal, somatic, or material components. The next thing is that, like in the 2024 version also, it's not an automatic success. There is no instance of this spell where you succeed automatically, you always have to make a d20 test for balance reasons. The next thing is that, like in the 2014 version, the character who casts Counterspell is the one who gets to make the roll. We make a d20 test adding our spellcasting ability modifier and our proficiency bonus. So the better of a spellcaster you are, the better you are at countering other people's spells. And the roll is made against the initial caster's spell save DC. So the idea for this is that the more powerful a mage, the harder it is to counter their spells. Even their low-level spells are more compact. They are stronger than the same spell cast by a novice spellcaster. So the roll no longer has anything to do with the level of the spell, it only has to do with the power of the caster whose spell you're trying to counter. Also, in this version, we keep the clear wording of the 24 version in regards to action economy. If you succeed on your roll, the spell dissipates with no effect, and the action, bonus action, or reaction used to cast it is wasted. It's always good to have clearer wording. And also, like in the 2014 version, the spell slot is used up if the counterspell succeeds. So there is no mention anywhere of something like that. And finally, like in 2014, there is still some guesswork in regards to what spell the enemy was casting, which makes Counterspell more fun. And this is where this is achieved. If the spell you're trying to counter is of a lower level, you have advantage on the roll. If it's at a higher level, you have disadvantage on the roll. So in this version of Counterspell, right, it's normally a third level spell. If you cast a third level and you're trying to counter another third level spell, you just roll with your spellcasting ability modifier, which is probably going to be your best spell ability modifier, and your proficiency bonus against their spell save DC. Now, if you're trying to counter a second level spell or a third level spell or a cantrip, because you've cast Counterspell at a higher level than that spell, you have advantage on the roll. If you cast a third level and you try to counter a fifth level spell, then you have disadvantage on the roll. However, you can upcast Counterspell. You can cast at level 5, which means that if you're trying to counter a spell of level 4 or lower, you have advantage. If you're trying to counter a level 5 spell, it's a straight roll, and at level 6 or higher, it's with disadvantage. So it still plays a big role at what level you cast Counterspell, but we never actually negate the roll, therefore making the spell a little bit more balanced, considering that the spell slot that the caster used is wasted if you succeed on your Counterspell. So that's it for today, you guys. Thank you very much for watching. Leave a like, this will help me out a lot, and subscribe if you want to see more. See you in the comments and see you on the next one. Have a great day.